I always thought it was really cool that the Lost Woods was in pretty much every single Zelda game, but a little fact that I had no idea about was that the Lost Woods dates back to the original Legend of Zelda. And I mean, you could see the inspiration that goes in the future games just by looking at the forest maze, but in the US version, the only character that ever confirms the name of the maze is this old woman who says it's the forest maze. However, in the Japanese version, if translated more literally, that it in fact translates to Lost Woods. See, in Japanese, it says Mayoi no Mori, and last minute edit here, I never expected this to be the case, but just to quadruple check, I also looked for the map that wasn't included with my physical copy of The Legend of Zelda, and there is one accurate translation right here on the map, where there it is, Lost Woods. But anyways, that's one of many things that we're going to be looking at today. Welcome to my YouTube series. It's called Region Break, and it's a sister series on this channel where we look at all the differences between the same game and try to contrast every single little difference that you can find between the two. Strangely, one of the things I personally found is that when you defeat Ganon at the end of the game, he turns into dust. But between the two versions, and those two versions being the Famicom disc version and the original release of the North American version, you can see a couple of pixels in Ganon's ashes that are different colors. In the US version, it looks like there's some pixels that match the palette of Link's skin, and honestly this may have been an intentional change from the Japanese version, where it seems as though those same pixels match the palette of Link's tunic, which then blends in a little too well with the pile of ash. This same effect happens when Link interacts with NPCs, like for example Zelda at the very end of the game. Most people recognize her as wearing a red dress, but take my word for it, if you somehow manage to beat the game with a green tunic, her dress would then be green as well. Anyway, speaking of Princess Zelda, that meets the end of the game here, and the first line of text you see is pretty much identical. And so obviously if you were to read the US side, it says, "Thanks Link, you're the hero of Hyrule." However, there's a subsequent text that reads out for the NES version and says, "Finally, peace returns to Hyrule. This ends the story." And the Japanese version is relatively the same, just not word for word. It can be interpreted a little differently. On the Legends of Localization website, it says, "And so peace returns to Hyrule. Thus ends this tale." One of the weirder changes between the two is that Link and Zelda disappear in the Japanese version, but on the US version, they managed to keep them on the screen. And those of you that beat the game might remember that all the now famous developers that worked on the original Legend of Zelda had weird aliases, what some people thought was mistranslations. In truth, these are pseudonyms that people used back in the NES days to prevent other companies from talent seeking. And so you can see between the two versions, they're identical. Well, almost identical. You might also notice that the font is completely different between the two versions. For some reason, on the Famicom disc version, the font is a lot thinner, and maybe to make it more legible on old school television screens, they swapped it over to fatter font for the US version. But if you guys have any other theories, feel free to just let me know in the comments section. Funny enough, it should be stated also that just like in the US, Japan got a re-release of The Legend of Zelda as well that's more closely related to the US release of The Legend of Zelda. And one of those relations that they share between the two is that they both have that fat font. One massive difference between the Famicom disc version and the Family Computer Cart version is that the Book of Magic and the Bible, yes, you heard me right, the Bible was in the original Legend of Zelda, are one and the same item, just changed between the two versions. But as you can see here, this change was first made in the US version. But one change that was not made in the US version that the Family Computer version shares exclusively is that the number 1 is placed at the end of The Legend of Zelda on the title screen. This was because this came out after Zelda 2, and Nintendo wanted retailers to make it very clear and distinct that if you're going to pick up The Legend of Zelda 1 and not 2, that you know for sure that that's what you're picking up. And it should be stated that this change was not made for the US re-release. But there is one massive change between the US version and the original Famicom disc version. That tiny font in the upper left-hand corner says The Legend of for the US version, whereas Japan was ahead of its time apparently and was already kicking off the series with a subtitle that we see so frequently now in the US today, starting off with The Hyrule Fantasy. And that subtitle even works itself over into the physical material, which there are a ton of differences between the two there as well. In the US, Hasbro did a line of dioramas featuring Link with his wooden sword attacking Gibdo, for example. But as you're going to see here over on the Japanese side of things, a lot more of their merchandise were chibi style, the most bizarre of which being Link in underwear with fangs and winking. But it's that chibi style that has persevered throughout decades and even has more modern merch that's exclusive to Japan, like the replica of the box art Link that was featured dominantly in the Family Computer Cart version of Zelda 1. I actually got one of those myself from Bai.Japan. But if you were looking for something a little more retro, you could definitely find it over there. Which, by the way, if you didn't know, Bai's a service website that lets you go over onto Japanese auction sites and does a couple of things on your behalf to make it even possible to buy this stuff. Like, for example, they convert your US dollars into yen. They also let the seller of these items ship the products over to their warehouse, whereby themselves will then ship the product internationally, whereas most of these sellers normally wouldn't. And honestly, one of the things you may never think to pick up as a fan of a certain game franchise is player's guides. But over in Japan, they've had a long history of player's guides that oftentimes have really interesting artwork that would display really well in a collection. And honestly, if any of the stuff on the screen seems interesting to you, I'll leave a direct link to Bai so that you can also get an extra 2,000 yen towards your purchase. And also, big thank you, Bai, for being a continued sponsor for the show Region Break. Anyways, by using Bai, I picked up the Famicom disc version of the game, as you saw earlier in the episode, so let's take a look at some of the material inside. And let's start by going back to the Famicom cart version. In this yellow bubble here, it says Action Adventure, giving the customer the idea of what genre this game is. And then on the back, in case you didn't believe me about why they changed the name to The Legend of Zelda 1, here's what all the text here says. By the way, it was translated by Quentin, just a longtime fan of the show who was generous with his time, so thank you, Quentin, appreciate it. Anyways, with his translation, the black font says, the disc version of The Legend of Zelda is back here on Famicom cassette. And the smaller paragraph that's in the white box says, The Legend of Zelda was the first game released on the Famicom disk system in 1986. Since then, it's been supported by many fans, spawning sequels such as The Adventure of Link and The Legend of Zelda for the Super Famicom. The Legend of Zelda 1 is a port of the first game in the series to a ROM cartridge. If you do not have a disk system, or if you played the Super Famicom version and you're interested in the previous release, please give it a try. So quite literally, the backsplash of this box is all about just talking about the legacy of The Legend of Zelda. It doesn't even seem to talk about the game itself in any capacity. Meanwhile, the disk system version has none of that, but that's just because there's nothing featured on the back of the case. But the manual does have some unique artwork. I'm actually going to try to save a ton of your time and just talk about the stuff that's different between all three versions. And of course, the Famicom disc version has unique Famicom disc artwork, how to take care of your Famicom disc, and also features exclusive stickers, which in my case, fortunately, was never used, which allows you to see all the unique artwork that Japanese players could have pasted onto their Famicom disc. And a lot of this artwork that's in the manual gets reused in the US manual. What's most bizarre is that there's like 3 different art styles being used here, and the same can be said for the US version as well. But for the most crudely drawn version of Link, there is some exclusive Famicom disc artwork like this one right here where he's riding on the disc, and another one that involves copying data, and so it shows 2 links. Something that's exclusive to the Famicom disc version is that they wrote out the names of the enemies in English, and for the most part, they kept it really faithful, even things you'd think wouldn't be faithful. But the 2 changes between this version and the US version is that Dart Nuck became Dark Nut, and the boss Testy Tart got changed. I mean, I can't imagine why. Oh, but you know what? If you had any guess as to why that would be the case, then the US version did not make it that much better, deciding to change the name to Manhandler. Dude, I'm just trying to run a clean show here. What is this? Alright, moving on to The Legend of Zelda 1, we can see a green Famicom cassette. It comes with a Japanese map, similar to the one that's in the US. The story synopsis now has a plain, fuzzy-looking background, whereas in the US and the Famicom disc version, they have a unique artwork of Hyrule. There's also a couple of unique pieces of art of Link that looks a little bit better than the crudely drawn Link that I showed earlier. But most surprisingly is all 3 versions have a depiction of what you're looking at when you see each map of each dungeon. And in this version, it's written out in English, when in the Famicom disc version, it was exclusively Japanese. So anyways, the Japanese interpretation of all these names is Eagle, Moon, Manji, Snake, Lizard, Dragon, Demon, Lion, Death Mountain. And then there's stuff in these manuals where there are no differences. It's just odd trivia. Like, for example, the famous swapping of R's and L's in Japanese language was something that the Legend of Zelda series also experienced, where in both the US and the Japanese manuals, Zoras are known as Zolas. And speaking of Zoras, they're one of the most strikingly different sprites between the 2 versions in-game. If you take a look here, the most immediate thing that you'll notice is that the Zoras in the Japanese version do not have a black outline. That's something that got changed for the US version and subsequently the Zelda 1 version that ended up on Famicom cassette. Also, the mouths are really different. In the Japanese version, Zora's mouth is pretty much closed, but to make more sense, in the US version, the mouth is wide open so it can shoot the ball at you. And the thing that's probably most lost in translation here is that it becomes apparent that when you look at the Japanese sprite, that the blue ring around the sprite is supposed to be a water ripple effect with its head poking out and causing a disturbance on the surface of the water. Whereas in the US version, it always kind of just looked like that the Zora had a fat neck, which now we know is not the case. Now let's tackle one of the other 5 senses and talk about the Pole's voice. If I had to guess, I think that this is probably the most well-known fact that you're going to see in this episode. And if you still didn't know, please let me know. I'm always fascinated to find out that what I consider common knowledge isn't quite that common. But in the Japanese version of the game uses family computer controllers, which are actually wired into the system. And the second player has a very interesting feature that the US never got. It's a little microphone that the player can speak into. And The Legend of Zelda took advantage of this feature by making it the Pole's voice's weakness. When players would speak into this microphone, it would kill all Pole voice on screen instantaneously. Now, probably the lesser known fact, and you can dunk on me in the comments if you'd like, but I did not know this. To compensate for the fact that the US does not have a microphone, the weakness of the Pole's voice is simply an arrow. Shooting an arrow at a Pole's voice will kill it in one hit. Now, it doesn't kill all the Pole voices on screen, sadly, but it's still so much better than having to hit it so many times that it goes into the double digits. Which, by the way, shame on me, because this old man in level 5 says the secret power is said to be in the arrow, which is meant for the Pole voices, which is a great segue for our next topic, translation differences. Because in Japanese, he says there are some creatures that are weak against sound. Obviously, both are referring to the Pole's voice, which that's super interesting, but now let's do a pivot over to the character select screen. One interesting difference between the Japanese and the English version is that elimination mode in English is referred to as kill mode in all Japanese versions, which is interesting for both versions. I guess they didn't want to use the term delete. Maybe it's supposed to be like an immersion thing where you're literally removing the life of Link permanently. I've never thought about it like that before. And the translation differences don't even end there. Starting off, one translated by our good friend Quentin yet again. At the end of the demo scroll, I noticed that the Triforce dialogue that rests above the Japanese version looks a lot longer than it should. And so when translated, it actually says the hidden Triforce of wisdom. Also, the paper that Link is holding up in the Japanese version has more damage around the corners than it does in the US version, probably so they could fit more characters onto that canvas. Also in Dungeon 1, the old man says the eastmost peninsula is the secret in the US version. This is completely different than what it is in the Japanese version, where he says you can't use arrows if you run out of money. One that's pretty close but not quite the same is when you go to collect a heart piece or some medicine from the old man. He says take any one you want in the US version, and in the Japanese version it says I'll give you whichever you want. Same idea. The famous line of it's a secret to everybody in the US version translates a little more accurately to something like now keep this a secret from everyone. Sound! Let's talk about sound. Now, surprisingly, a lot is very similar, but because the original Legend of Zelda was on a Famicom disc, there's an extra sound channel that the US version never had. And so a lot of the sound fonts for certain things are completely different. Here's a couple quick examples. Let's start with the death noise. Even the bosses sound completely different. Here's a couple of different bosses for you and how they stack up against each other. But let's talk about one of the most iconic themes of all time, the title screen of the game. The Famicom disc version sounds pretty different. One of the key differences is the sound of a large bell that perpetually gets banged throughout the song. Here, give it a listen. And now for comparison's sake, here's the US version. I'm just gonna play a little bit of it just so that you can hear just how different it is. Here's a couple of shorter themes like the flute. And now here's that little mystery jingle. And here's when you grab an item. And here's when you grab an inventory item. And here's the differences between the ending themes. And with that said, I just wanted to quickly say thank you to the Legends of Localization. The website owner has his own book. I recommend you click the link in the video description so you can pick up a copy for yourself if you'd like to own a more comprehensive look at every single little detail. Big thank you to the Legends of Localization for their website, though, for that public resource. If you feel like I've earned your sub, please hit subscribe. It helps my videos show up a little more often on your homepage. New videos every single Friday with my co-host Snipey. And with that said, I'm going to let the Japanese version play itself out. Thanks for watching.